The hum of fluorescent lights echoed through the gleaming marble lobby of Sterling and Pierce, a towering corporate fortress nestled in the heart of the city. Grace Carter adjusted her faded gray cleaning uniform, her gloved hands clutching a worn mop handle as she moved across the polished floors. It was well past office hours, but the faint glow of late-night monitors still flickered from executive offices above. Grace had worked here for nearly a decade, quietly slipping through corridors and conference rooms, her presence as inconspicuous as a shadow in the night. No one really saw her. Not the sharp-suited executives who strutted past her in expensive shoes, not the interns clutching their coffee cups as if they were life rafts, and certainly not Richard Hale, the CEO whose face stared down from the wall of framed portraits in the main hallway. But Grace noticed everything. She noticed the discarded memos left on desks, the urgent whispers behind half-closed doors, and the fleeting looks of exhaustion on the faces of employees who had long surrendered to the weight of their jobs. She knew who stayed late, who left early, and who poured an extra splash of whiskey into their coffee mug at noon. Yet, despite her quiet vigilance, Grace was invisible. "Move aside, please," a young executive barked one evening as she carefully maneuvered her cleaning cart around the hallway. He didn't even glance at her face. To him, she was just another object to sidestep, no different from the office furniture lining the hall. But Grace wasn't angry. She wasn't bitter. She had learned long ago that anger only clouded judgment, and she needed her mind clear. She had a role to play, a silent observer in a world of polished lies and gilded ambition. In the dim light of an executive conference room, Grace paused, her tired eyes drifting across the long mahogany table where major decisions were made, decisions that rippled out into hundreds of lives. Papers were strewn across the surface, half-empty water bottles abandoned beside branded notepads. "Another late night," she muttered under her breath, her voice carrying a note of quiet resolve. From somewhere above, muffled laughter echoed, a cruel, sharp sound that made Grace's chest tighten. She glanced up at the frosted glass window of an office door, where silhouettes moved against the pale light. The executives were celebrating something, probably another record-breaking quarter, achieved by squeezing just a little more out of the employees below them. Grace shook her head and returned to her task, her movements deliberate and methodical. The truth was, she wasn't just a cleaning lady. Grace Carter was a keeper of secrets, a collector of overlooked details, and, though no one in the building realized it, the single most powerful person in Sterling and Pierce. But no one needed to know that. Not yet. As the clock crept past midnight and the city outside settled into silence, Grace wheeled her cart into the janitor's closet, closed the door behind her, and leaned against it with a long exhale. In the quiet dark, her sharp eyes glimmered with something rare in a place like this: determination. She knew her time would come, and when it did, Sterling and Pierce would never be the same again. The morning sun spilled pale light across the glass facade of Sterling and Pierce, but inside the air was thick with tension. Beneath the gleaming veneer of polished marble and towering glass walls, shadows of greed and fear festered like an invisible mold. In the executive suite on the top floor, Richard Hale, the CEO of Sterling and Pierce, leaned back in his leather chair. His suit was sharp, his cufflinks gleamed, and his smile, when it appeared, was as cold as the steel skyline outside his window. Richard was a man who believed in results, no matter the cost. "Cutting the bonus pool was a smart move, Richard," one of his senior managers said with a chuckle, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "They'll complain, sure, but where else are they going to go? Everyone's replaceable." Richard smirked, his icy blue eyes narrowing. "Exactly. Loyalty isn't bought with bonuses, it's bought with fear of losing a paycheck. Let them grumble." Downstairs, the employees of Sterling and Pierce moved like clockwork, their faces etched with exhaustion and quiet resignation. The open concept offices buzzed with activity, but the undercurrent of anxiety was palpable. Layoffs were whispered about in the break room, and the weight of unspoken threats hung heavy in every email marked urgent. In the corner of one of these floors, Grace Carter worked quietly, emptying trash bins and wiping down desks while fragments of conversations floated around her. "I heard they're slashing benefits again," one junior analyst muttered to her colleague. "Typical." Meanwhile, Richard Hale probably just bought another yacht, the other replied bitterly. Grace kept her head down, but her ears were open. She moved with a practiced ease, blending into the background like a faint breeze, felt but never truly seen. She had seen good people pushed past their breaking points. She had seen interns crying in bathroom stalls, managers staring blankly at spreadsheets long after they should have gone home, and promising young talent walking out with cardboard boxes after sudden layoffs. But the worst moments came late at night, when Richard Hale and his senior managers would joke about their employees over whiskey glasses, their laughter echoing through the empty halls. "They'll work harder if they think the axe is swinging," Richard had once said, his voice sharp with cruel amusement. Grace had been nearby when he said it, a mop in her hand and her heart heavy in her chest. That was the moment she realized Sterling & Pierce wasn't just another cold corporate empire. It was a machine designed to grind people down and discard them when they were no longer profitable. But Grace wasn't just watching anymore. Her hands trembled slightly as she squeezed the damp cloth in her gloved fingers, her chest tightening with a mix of anger and sadness. These were real people with real families, real dreams, none of which seemed to matter to Richard Hale. As the day stretched into evening, Grace paused in front of the framed photos lining the hallway. Past CEOs stared down at her, their expressions frozen in oil paint. For a fleeting moment, she wondered if any of them had once been like Richard, if greed had turned them cold, or if they had always been that way. But Grace wasn't here to dwell on the past. She had work to do. In the dim light of the setting sun, she moved with purpose, her quiet presence weaving through the corridors of power, gathering fragments of information like puzzle pieces. She was no longer just a bystander. Something had to change, and Grace Carter would make sure it did. The night was still as Grace Carter stepped into the shadowed corners of her modest apartment. The faint hum of distant traffic filtered through her window, and the glow of the city skyline flickered against the glass panes. She dropped her keys on the chipped wooden counter and sat at her small kitchen table, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded an old leather folder. Inside were neatly arranged documents, papers that most people in Sterling & Pierce would never expect a cleaning lady to possess. Stock certificates, letters from lawyers, and at the very top, the will of her late husband, Charles Carter. Charles had once been one of the original investors in Sterling & Pierce, long before corporate greed had gnawed away at the company's soul. When he passed away, he left Grace something priceless. Controlling shares in the company, enough to give her a voice that could shake the very foundations of the corporate giant. But Grace had kept her inheritance a secret, buried beneath the quiet routine of her daily work. It wasn't because she lacked courage, it was because she was patient. She needed to see the cracks in the empire, the weak spots hidden behind polished boardroom doors. She traced her finger over Charles's signature on the will, her chest tight with emotion. "You always believed in me, Charlie," she whispered into the stillness. Grace wasn't a businesswoman. She didn't speak the polished language of boardrooms or understand the intricate dance of corporate politics. But what she did understand was people, their fears, their motivations, and their secrets. She'd been invisible long enough to see the truth no one else noticed. Her mind wandered back to the executive floor earlier that day. The arrogant smirks, the cruel laughter, the casual dismissiveness. Richard Hale had no idea that the woman mopping the floor outside his office held more power than any of his senior managers combined. Grace leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting toward the framed photo of her late husband on the wall. His smile was gentle, his eyes kind. "I'll make this right, Charlie. I promise." But she couldn't act yet, not without more evidence, not without a plan. Grace knew the game she was about to play was dangerous. Richard Hale was a man who crushed anyone who threatened his throne, and she couldn't afford a single misstep. At work the next morning, Grace moved with her usual quiet efficiency, her cleaning cart rolling softly across the marble floors. But there was something different in her posture now, a steeliness in her eyes, a quiet determination in her step. She lingered longer in key places, near Richard Hale's office door, outside finance meetings, and in the executive lounge, where conversations often turned candid after a glass of expensive whiskey. From the corner of her eye, she noticed a junior employee, Nate Wallace, a fresh-faced intern with a nervous energy, getting scolded by his manager. The young man nodded quickly, clutching a thick binder to his chest as if it might shield him from the harsh words being thrown his way. "Get it together, Nate," the manager snapped. "You screw up this report, and you'll be packing up your desk by Friday." The manager walked away, leaving Nate frozen in place, his shoulders slumped. Grace watched him for a moment before stepping forward. "Rough day?" she said softly. Nate flinched, startled by her presence. "Oh, I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't see you there." Grace smiled gently. "Don't worry about it, son. Keep your chin up. You'll figure it out." Nate gave her a weak smile before hurrying away. Grace's chest tightened as she watched him disappear down the hallway. Another soul caught in the gears of Sterling and Pierce's relentless machine. But not for much longer. That night, Grace returned to her small apartment, her mind racing as she pieced together the fragments of information she'd gathered. Finance reports, late-night conversations, the worried glances exchanged by employees. She pulled out her leather folder once more and added a few handwritten notes to the growing stack of evidence. Grace Carter was no longer just a silent observer. She was a shareholder, a keeper of secrets, and now, a strategist. The game had begun, and Richard Hale had no idea that his most dangerous opponent was the woman he had walked past 1,000 times without a second glance. In the stillness of her small kitchen, Grace let out a slow breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's time." The city lights glittered outside the towering windows of Sterling and Pierce, but inside the executive lounge the atmosphere was anything but sparkling. The faint smell of expensive whiskey hung heavy in the air as a group of senior managers leaned back in leather armchairs, their laughter sharp and biting. Grace Carter moved quietly down the hallway, her cleaning cart gliding over the pristine marble floor. It was late, and the building had mostly emptied, but the executives stayed behind, celebrating, scheming, or simply reveling in their untouchable power. Through the slightly ajar door, Grace heard them. "Honestly, if half of these employees walked out tomorrow, we'd replace them by lunchtime," one voice said, followed by snickers of agreement. "Did you see the faces in that last meeting?" another added. "They're like frightened rabbits. One whisper of layoffs and they'll do whatever we say." Fear's good for productivity. The words hit Grace like icy shards, each one sharper than the last. She gripped the handle of her cart, her knuckles whitening as their laughter echoed in her ears. These weren't just careless words, they were weapons, aimed at people who had given their time, their energy, and their lives to this company. Her breathing steadied as she stepped away from the door. In the dim light of the hallway, her shadow stretched long against the polished floor. For so long, she had watched, observing, listening, waiting. But now something inside her snapped. This wasn't just about poor management or corporate greed anymore. This was about human decency. Grace pushed her cart to a quiet corner and pulled out a small, worn leather notebook from her pocket. Its pages were filled with scribbled notes, dates, names, overheard conversations, financial discrepancies. It wasn't just a collection of observations anymore. It was evidence. She flipped to a fresh page and jotted down the time, date, and snippets of the conversation she'd just overheard. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her chest like a heavy stone. She thought about Nate Wallace, the nervous young intern she'd spoken to the other day, clutching his binder like a lifeline. She thought about the single mother from accounting who had confided in her about her struggles to keep up with mounting bills. She thought about Charles, her late husband, whose belief in this company had once been unshakable. The faces and stories swirled in her mind, each one feeding the growing fire in her chest. "This can't go on," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling with both determination and grief. But Grace knew she couldn't act impulsively. If she confronted Richard Hale or the board without airtight evidence, they would dismiss her, mock her, and bury the truth under expensive lawyers and polished press releases. She needed more: documents, witnesses, undeniable proof that couldn't be ignored. In the weeks that followed, Grace moved through the halls of Sterling and Pierce with renewed focus. She lingered near executive offices, noting details others overlooked: a shredded document here, an unlocked filing cabinet there. She befriended overlooked employees, The janitors, the receptionists, the late-night IT staff, people like her, invisible but all-seeing. "Grace, you're always here so late," a young IT technician named Liam said one night as he packed up his laptop. She smiled warmly. "Night owls like us keep this place running, don't we?" Liam chuckled and nodded before heading out, leaving Grace alone in the flickering light of the empty office floor. But she wasn't alone. Not really. She was surrounded by stories, by lives intertwined with this place, and by a growing weight of truth she couldn't ignore. Back in her small apartment, Grace spread out her gathered notes and documents across the kitchen table. Every piece was a thread, and slowly she was weaving them together into a tapestry of undeniable evidence. A faded photograph of her husband rested beside the papers. Charles's eyes, kind and steady, seemed to watch her from the past. "We built something good once," she said softly, her voice breaking, "and I won't let them destroy it." Grace Carter wasn't just gathering evidence anymore. She was building a case. A case that, when the time was right, would bring Richard Hale and his cronies to their knees. But as she carefully filed away the documents, a flicker of fear crept into her chest. These were powerful men, men who would do anything to protect their empire. She paused, closing her eyes for a moment before whispering into the quiet, "Whatever happens, I have to see this through." The breaking point had come, and Grace Carter was ready. The clock struck midnight as Grace Carter sat hunched over her small kitchen table, papers and handwritten notes spread out before her like pieces of a fractured puzzle. The dim light from the single bulb above cast long shadows over her weary face, but her eyes were sharp, focused, and determined. A stack of financial reports lay to her left, riddled with discrepancies. Bonuses cut, funds misappropriated, and stock buybacks disguised as necessary expenditures. To her right, her leather-bound notebook overflowed with conversations she had overheard, dates carefully noted, and key players identified. Grace sighed and leaned back, her hands trembling slightly as she took a sip from her chipped mug of tea. The weight of what she was planning pressed down on her chest like a heavy stone. But there was no turning back now. In the silence of her apartment, the memories of recent weeks played in her mind. Executives mocking the fears of their employees, Richard Hale's smirking face as he slashed budgets while sipping $1,000 whiskey, and Nate Wallace's defeated posture as he clutched that binder. "This isn't just about evidence," Grace whispered to herself. "This is about people. Real people." But she knew she couldn't do this alone. The next day, Grace arrived at Sterling and Pierce earlier than usual. The building was still waking up, the air thick with the scent of fresh coffee and printer ink. She moved through the hallways with her usual unassuming grace, but today her steps carried a different weight. She spotted Liam, the young IT technician, hunched over his laptop in a small corner office. His hoodie was pulled tight over his head and his fingers flew across the keyboard. "Morning, Liam," Grace said softly. Liam jumped slightly, his face breaking into an embarrassed smile. "Oh, hey, Grace, you're here early?" She glanced around to make sure no one was nearby before stepping closer. "Liam, I need your help with something." "Important?" His smile faded, replaced by a look of curiosity and a little fear. "What's going on?" Grace hesitated for just a moment before pulling out a folded document from her apron pocket. It was one of the financial reports she'd uncovered, with glaring inconsistencies highlighted in yellow ink. Liam's eyes widened as he scanned the numbers. How did you get this?" "Don't worry about that," Grace said firmly. "What I need to know is if you can help me access more files they don't want people like us to see." Liam hesitated, glancing toward the door as if someone might be listening. "Grace, this could get us both fired, or worse." Grace's voice softened, her eyes locking onto his. "Liam, this company is hurting people, good people. And if we don't do something, it's only going to get worse. You're smart, and you see things no one else does. Please, help me." For a long moment, Liam said nothing, but then he nodded, his face set with quiet determination. "Okay, I'll help you." Over the next few weeks, Grace and Liam worked together in secret. Liam used his IT access to pull files, emails, financial records, and private memos, while Grace continued to move through the building, gathering information firsthand and speaking quietly with other overlooked employees. She met with Elena Morales, an older accountant with tired eyes and a sharp mind, who had noticed discrepancies in budget reports but had been too afraid to speak up. She spoke with Tom Harris, a janitor like herself, who had overheard senior managers talking in careless whispers late at night. Bit by bit, piece by piece, Grace built her case. But it wasn't just about the numbers, it was about the stories. The faces behind the statistics, the families behind the paychecks, and the lives that were slowly being crushed under the weight of greed and indifference. One evening, as Grace and Liam reviewed their findings in a dimly lit back room, Liam let out a low whistle. This is damning, Grace. If this gets out, Richard Hale is finished." Grace's expression was steady, but her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "We're not just exposing him, Liam. We're saving this company from itself." But as the weight of their findings grew heavier, so did the risks. Grace knew that once she stepped into that boardroom with her evidence, there would be no turning back. She would be facing Richard Hale and the board members, powerful people with everything to lose. As Liam packed away the files and slipped out the back door, Grace lingered for a moment in the quiet room. She closed her eyes and whispered a silent prayer, her heart pounding in her chest. "Charlie, if you're watching, I hope I make you proud." When she opened her eyes, they were clear and unflinching. The pieces were in place. The evidence was airtight. The stage was set. It was time to confront the empire. The conference room on the top floor of Sterling and Pierce gleamed under cold fluorescent lights. The long mahogany table stretched across the room, polished to a mirror-like sheen, reflecting the stern faces of the board members seated around it. At the head of the table sat Richard Hale, the CEO, his tailored suit pristine and his icy blue eyes surveying the room like a hawk scanning for weakness. Beside him sat a collection of high-powered executives, men and women who had climbed their way to these seats through sharp elbows and sharper words. The air crackled with quiet authority and unspoken power. But today, something felt different. There was an unease in the room, a faint tremor just beneath the surface. The door creaked open and Grace Carter stepped inside. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The room, this towering space of wealth, privilege, and unchecked power, was the last place anyone would expect to see a cleaning lady. Richard's brows furrowed slightly, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. What is the meaning of this? Why is she here? Grace didn't flinch. She stepped forward, clutching her leather folder against her chest. Her uniform, though clean and pressed, felt out of place among the sea of silk ties and designer dresses. But her posture was steady, her voice unwavering. "I'm here because I have something to say, and I suggest you listen." Murmurs spread across the table. Some board members exchanged incredulous looks, others smirked as if this were some kind of joke. But Richard's sharp eyes locked onto her, his expression hardening. "You have no business here," he said coldly. "This is a private meeting." "No, Mr. Hale," Grace interrupted, her voice firm but calm. "This is my meeting, and it's time you heard the truth." She stepped closer to the table, placing her leather folder on its glossy surface. The room fell silent as she began to speak. "For years, I've watched this company from the shadows. I've listened to your conversations, cleaned up after your parties, and seen the consequences of your decisions written on the faces of the people you claim to lead." Her voice trembled slightly, but it carried through the room with a clarity that silenced every whisper. "I've seen loyal employees discarded like yesterday's trash. I've seen bonuses cut while you celebrated with champagne. I've seen young interns like Nate Wallace pushed to the brink of exhaustion, terrified of losing jobs they worked so hard to earn." Richard leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his smirk barely concealing his irritation. "This is ridiculous. Security." "Sit down, Richard." The voice came from one of the senior board members, Margaret Ellis, a woman known for her sharp wit and even sharper tongue. Her piercing gaze locked onto Richard before flicking back to Grace. "Continue, Miss Carter," Margaret said calmly. Grace opened the leather folder and began laying out the evidence, documents detailing financial misconduct, emails exposing unethical practices, and handwritten notes recounting conversations overheard late at night. Each piece landed on the table like a hammer striking an anvil, the weight of truth reverberating through the room. "I am not just a cleaning lady," Grace said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. I am the majority shareholder of Sterling & Pierce, a position I inherited from my late husband, Charles Carter, and I have the authority to hold you accountable." The air seemed to be sucked out of the room. Richard's face turned pale, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. The other board members exchanged shocked glances, the realization sinking in. "You've all sat here and allowed this to happen," Grace continued, her voice rising slightly. "You've turned a blind eye to corruption, greed, and the suffering of the very people who built this company from the ground up." Margaret Ellis leaned forward, her sharp eyes studying Grace. "What do you want, Miss Carter?" Grace drew a steady breath. "I want accountability. I want Richard Hale removed as CEO, effective immediately. I want this company to honor the people who work tirelessly to keep it running. I want transparency, ethics, and humanity brought back into this institution." A heavy silence followed. Richard slammed his hand on the table, his voice trembling with fury. "This is absurd. You think these people will side with you? You're—" "Enough, Richard," Margaret said sharply, cutting him off. One by one, the board members spoke. Some hesitated, but the tide was turning. The evidence was undeniable, the weight of Grace's words inescapable. When the final vote was cast, the result was clear. Richard Hale was removed as CEO of Sterling & Pierce. Security arrived moments later to escort him from the building. As Richard passed by Grace on his way out, his eyes burned with quiet rage. "You'll regret this," he hissed. But Grace didn't flinch. She simply met his glare with a calm resolve. "No, Richard, I won't." As the boardroom emptied, Margaret Ellis approached Grace, her expression softer now. "You did something extraordinary today, Miss Carter," Margaret said quietly. "You reminded us what leadership looks like." Grace nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't over. There's still so much work to do." Margaret smiled faintly. "Then let's get to it." The towering glass windows of the boardroom reflected the morning sun as it broke over the horizon, bathing Sterling & Pierce in golden light. Grace stood alone for a moment, looking out at the city below. Her reflection stared back at her, a woman who had once been invisible, now standing tall in the light of day. The corridors of Sterling & Pierce were eerily quiet as Richard Hale walked toward the elevator, flanked by two security guards. His polished leather shoes struck the marble floor with sharp, hollow echoes. The weight of his sudden dismissal pressed against his shoulders like a heavy chain, each step carrying the bitter taste of defeat. Employees had begun to gather along the edges of the hallway, their faces a mixture of disbelief, curiosity, and something else, relief. Whispered conversations rippled through the crowd, and some dared to make eye contact with the man who had once ruled the company with an iron fist. Grace Carter stood at the far end of the hallway, her gloved hands folded neatly in front of her, her face calm but her eyes steady. She wasn't gloating, nor did she show any trace of satisfaction. She simply watched as Richard passed her, his jaw tight and his eyes avoiding hers. As he reached the elevator doors, Richard turned, his face pale with a mix of anger and humiliation. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze as his sharp eyes locked onto Grace. "You think you've won, don't you?" he said, his voice low but sharp, like a knife pressed against glass. "But you don't know what comes next. You have no idea how messy this will get." Grace met his gaze, her voice steady and calm. "No, Richard. I don't think I've won. This isn't about winning or losing. It's about doing what's right, something you forgot a long time ago." The elevator dinged softly and the doors slid open. The security guards motioned for Richard to step inside, but he hesitated, his glare lingering on Grace for a moment longer before he finally stepped in. The doors closed with a final, metallic thud. The crowd dispersed slowly, employees exchanging glances and quiet murmurs as they returned to their desks. But the energy in the air had shifted, like a storm had passed and the first rays of sunlight were breaking through. Back in the boardroom, the air was still heavy with the aftermath of the showdown. The leather chairs sat empty now, pushed back haphazardly as if their occupants had fled a battlefield. Grace stood near the head of the table, her leather folder clutched tightly in her hands. Margaret Ellis approached her, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. "You did something remarkable today, Grace," Margaret said, her voice calm but tinged with respect. "But this is only the beginning." Grace nodded, her voice soft. I know, cleaning up the mess Richard left behind won't be easy, but it's worth doing. Margaret studied her for a moment before placing a firm hand on Grace's shoulder. You have a seat at this table now, Miss Carter. Use it well. The weight of Margaret's words settled heavily on Grace's chest. She wasn't just a bystander anymore. She wasn't invisible. She was now part of the decisions that would shape Sterling and Pierce for years to come. Word spread quickly throughout the company. Richard Hale was gone. Conversations buzzed in the break rooms, emails were exchanged with thinly veiled excitement, and a cautious sense of hope began to bloom among the employees. Grace walked through the office floors later that day, her uniform still neatly pressed, her hair tied back as always. But something was different now. People noticed her. "Thank you, Miss Carter," whispered Nate Wallace, clutching his binder tightly. His voice cracked slightly, his gratitude raw and sincere. A single mother from accounting, Lydia Reynolds, stopped Grace near the elevators, tears welling in her tired eyes. "You saved us, Grace. I can't thank you enough." Grace offered a small, warm smile. "No one should have to work in fear, Lydia. Things will get better, I promise." But beneath the gratitude and cautious optimism, Grace knew the hard work was just beginning. Richard's removal was just one battle in a much larger war. That evening, as the sun dipped below the city skyline, Grace stood by one of the massive windows overlooking the streets below. The city lights flickered like stars, each one representing a life, a story, a dream. Her reflection stared back at her. A woman who had been invisible, overlooked, underestimated. And yet here she was, standing in the heart of power with the weight of an entire company resting on her shoulders. The faint scent of whiskey lingered in the air, a reminder of the shadows Richard Hale had left behind. But Grace wasn't afraid of those shadows anymore. In her pocket, she carried a small photograph of her late husband, Charles. She pulled it out, her fingers brushing over the edges of the worn paper. "I hope you're proud, Charlie," she whispered softly, her voice breaking just slightly. For a brief moment, tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away and straightened her shoulders. The fight wasn't over. There was still so much to fix, so many people depending on her. But for now, in this fleeting moment of quiet victory, Grace allowed herself a small smile. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, the air was clear, and hope, fragile as it was, had begun to take root in the halls of Sterling and Pierce. The days following Richard Hale's departure felt like the first breath of fresh air after a storm. The oppressive weight that had hung over Sterling and Pierce for so long was beginning to lift, but the damage left behind couldn't be ignored. In her modest office, once an unused storage closet, Grace Carter sat at a desk piled high with documents, employee feedback forms, and stacks of financial reports. A half-empty cup of coffee sat forgotten by her elbow as she reviewed page after page of policy changes and budget reallocations. The door creaked open, and Margaret Ellis stepped inside, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. "You look like you could use this," she said with a faint smile. Grace chuckled softly, accepting the cup. "Thank you, Margaret. I'm starting to think Richard's greatest crime wasn't his greed, it was the chaos he left behind." Margaret sat across from her, her expression softening. "The chaos is temporary, Grace. The change you're leading? That's going to last." Grace's first official act was to call a company-wide town hall meeting. Hundreds of employees filled the grand auditorium, junior analysts, senior managers, interns, and janitors alike. For many of them, this was the first time they had ever been addressed openly by someone in leadership who seemed to see them. Grace stepped onto the stage, the lights casting a soft glow around her as she faced the crowd. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice steady but warm. "My name is Grace Carter, and I know many of you know me as the woman who cleaned your offices and emptied your trash bins. But today, I'm standing here as someone who believes in the heart of this company and in each and every one of you." The crowd was silent, hanging on her every word. For too long, Sterling and Pierce has operated on fear, secrecy, and exploitation. That ends today. Starting now, we are implementing immediate changes. Transparency in our finances, fair wages, restored bonuses, and most importantly, respect for every single employee who walks through these doors. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd, some skeptical, others hopeful. "We will hold regular town hall meetings like this one. Your voices will be heard. Your concerns will be addressed. Because this company isn't just about profits, it's about people. The room erupted into applause. Some employees stood, clapping until their palms turned red. Grace let the sound wash over her, her chest tightening with emotion. In the weeks that followed, Grace made herself visible, not from a lofty corner office, but on the office floors, in the break rooms, and during lunch hours. She held one-on-one meetings with employees, listening to their grievances, their fears, and their ideas. One afternoon, she sat across from Lydia Reynolds, the single mother from accounting. "Lydia, I've reviewed your salary, and it's unacceptable. You've been here for 7 years, and your pay hasn't kept up with your contributions." Lydia's eyes welled with tears. I just wanted to be able to take care of my son, Grace." Grace reached across the desk and took Lydia's hand. "That's exactly what you're going to do now. Starting next month, your salary will reflect your value to this company." In the IT department, Liam was promoted to a leadership role. "You've shown integrity and courage, Liam. This company needs people like you at the helm." The changes weren't just cosmetic, they were structural. Bonuses were reinstated for all employees. HR protocols were restructured to ensure transparency and accountability. Ethics training became mandatory for all senior management. Regular anonymous feedback surveys were distributed and taken seriously. Grace ensured that these changes weren't just words on paper, they were embedded in the company's culture. Not everyone was on board. Some senior managers bristled at the new protocols, seeing them as threats to their autonomy. Others whispered behind closed doors, doubting Grace's leadership, but Grace faced them head-on. In every meeting, every decision, she carried herself with quiet confidence and unyielding resolve. "This isn't about control," she said during one tense board meeting. "This is about trust. If you can't earn the trust of the people you lead, then you have no place leading them." One by one, the resistance began to crumble. Months later, the atmosphere at Sterling & Pierce was different. Employees walked with their heads held higher. Smiles replaced nervous glances in the break rooms. Late-night anxiety over sudden layoffs gave way to a renewed sense of security. Nate Wallace, the once nervous intern, now confidently presented a quarterly report to the boardroom. His voice didn't shake, his shoulders didn't slump. And when he finished, Margaret Ellis gave him a nod of approval. Grace stood in the back of the room, watching him with quiet pride. One evening, as the city lights flickered below, Grace stood in front of the same towering window she had once stared out of after Richard's dismissal. Margaret joined her, 2 glasses of water in hand. "It's been quite a journey, hasn't it?" Grace smiled faintly. "It's not over yet, but we're on the right path." Margaret nodded. "You know, Grace, you've done something extraordinary here. You've reminded everyone that real power isn't about titles or offices, it's about integrity." The 2 women clinked their glasses together, the sound soft and pure against the backdrop of the city's hum. The changes at Sterling & Pierce weren't perfect. Mistakes were still made, and challenges still arose. But the foundation had shifted. Under Grace's quiet but firm leadership, the company began to heal. One Percy, one story at a time. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces of the building where shadows once lingered, hope began to bloom. The mid-morning sun poured through the large glass windows of Sterling & Pierce, casting a golden glow across the bustling office floors. The atmosphere had shifted. The weight of fear and resentment had given way to something fragile yet powerful. Hope. Employees moved with a sense of purpose now, their shoulders no longer hunched under invisible burdens. Conversations were lighter, smiles more frequent, and laughter, genuine laughter, could be heard echoing from the break rooms. At the heart of this quiet revolution stood Grace Carter. She walked the halls not as an invisible figure pushing a cleaning cart, but as a leader who had earned respect, not through titles or grand speeches, but through quiet courage, genuine compassion, and unwavering determination. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, Grace found herself in the company cafeteria, holding a cup of tea and gazing out at the skyline. The chatter of employees filled the air, but one voice stood out, a hesitant, nervous tone she recognized immediately. "Miss Carter?" Grace turned to see Nate Wallace, the young intern who had once clutched a binder like a life preserver. Today he stood taller, his tie neatly knotted and his eyes filled with something she hadn't seen in him before. confidence. "Nate," Grace said warmly, "it's good to see you. How are things going?" He shifted on his feet, clutching a tablet close to his chest. "Better. Much better, actually. I wanted to thank you, not just for me but for everyone here. You changed everything." Grace smiled softly, her eyes glimmering with emotion. "I didn't do it alone, Nate. People like you, people with integrity and courage, you're the reason this company is changing." Nate nodded, his voice steady this time. "Still, you showed us that someone sees us, someone cares. That's not something we'll forget." Before he walked away, Nate hesitated and then said quietly, "You made me believe in myself, Miss Carter. Thank you." As he disappeared into the crowd, Grace's chest tightened and she took a slow breath, letting the moment wash over her. The gratitude didn't stop with Nate. Over the following weeks, Grace received quiet nods of thanks in the hallways, handwritten notes left on her desk, and even the occasional bouquet of flowers from anonymous employees. From Lydia Reynolds in accounting, who now had enough financial security to care for her son without fear of eviction. From Tom Harris, the janitor who now had better healthcare benefits and felt proud of his role in the company. From Liam, who had grown into a confident leader in the IT department and who regularly shared ideas to improve efficiency. These moments weren't grand or loud, but they carried immense weight. They were proof that change had taken root, that seeds of trust had been planted, and that those seeds were beginning to bloom. A month later, the company hosted an Employee Appreciation Day, an event Richard Hale would have dismissed as a waste of resources. But now, it was a day filled with light, laughter, and connection. The once sterile and cold lobby had been transformed into a warm space with string lights, banners, and long tables filled with food and drinks. Teams mingled freely, analysts laughing with janitors, managers sharing stories with interns. Grace stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the scene unfold with a quiet smile. Margaret Ellis appeared at her side, holding 2 glasses of lemonade. "You've done something remarkable here, Grace. You didn't just change policies, you changed hearts." Grace took one of the glasses and clinked it lightly against Margaret's. "It wasn't just me. People wanted change. They just needed someone to show them it was possible." Margaret's expression softened. "It takes extraordinary courage to be that someone." Grace looked out over the crowd, faces illuminated by smiles, voices lifted in joy. For the first time in a long while, the building felt alive, not just occupied. Toward the end of the day, a young employee approached Grace hesitantly. She couldn't have been more than 22, her ID badge still crisp and new. "Miss Carter?" the young woman said softly. Grace turned, her warm smile immediately putting the intern at ease. "Yes, dear?" The intern held out a small, carefully wrapped gift. "I know this isn't much, but I wanted you to have this as a thank you from all of us." Grace unwrapped the gift slowly, revealing a small, engraved plaque. It read, "To Grace Carter, a leader, a light, a legacy." For a moment, Grace couldn't speak. Her throat tightened, and tears welled in her eyes as she ran her fingers over the engraving. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This means more to me than you'll ever know." The young intern smiled shyly and disappeared back into the crowd, leaving Grace standing there, holding a symbol of her impact. That night, as the building emptied and the lights dimmed, Grace found herself back in the grand boardroom. The leather chairs were empty, and the city's lights flickered through the towering glass windows. She placed the engraved plaque on the head of the table, the same spot where Richard Hale had once sat in arrogance and indifference. For a moment, she simply stood there, her hand resting on the cool wood of the table, her reflection gazing back at her from the window. This was more than a victory. It was a transformation, not just of a company, but of people, of purpose, of culture. Grace closed her eyes and let the quiet settle around her. Tomorrow the work would continue. But tonight she allowed herself this moment, a moment of gratitude, of peace, and of quiet triumph.